Well, good afternoon, or I guess it's almost evening. I don't know, should I say good evening, good afternoon? Close enough. All right, well, let's talk a little bit about what it means to become an architect now that you've all disappeared as they bank down the lights on me here. A lot of us that get into this line of work, I think we end up developing a very similar goal. We find ourselves in positions where we think, I want to be the person who gets to make those tough technical decisions. I want to be the quote-unquote architect. I remember one of the very first projects I was ever on. I really enjoyed interacting with our architect. He just seemed like this very intelligent, sort of almost omnipresent sort of being on our project. And we actually started referring to him as Dr. Evil because he'd sort of like show up at various points and say, hey guys, small matter of implementation detail, but we need to completely scrap everything you guys just did in the last 2 weeks and start over. That was a lot of fun for us on the development staff. Worked with a lot of folks who have become architects, and there's a lot of different paths to getting there. But yet a lot of us still sit back and look up that mountain and say, hey, that's the kind of thing I want to do. That's the direction I want to take my career. That sounds like a fun job. Now, the downside is a lot of us get there and go, well, wait, this isn't quite what I expected it to be. I know a lot of us, I think, have this belief that, well, once I become the architect, I will have complete autonomy. I will have complete authority. Anything I say will go, and then you realize that, no, that's actually not how it works. It's really not quite that simple. One of the most challenging things about getting into the architecture ranks is you realize you now need to play a lot more politics than you ever did as a developer. And you realize very quickly that there's a whole lot of competing agendas at play here, and it's now somehow become my responsibility to balance those out. Part of what I think makes it really hard to be an architect, to become an architect, is to realize that the skills it takes to put you in that role are not the same skills that will keep you in that role. And it certainly isn't the skill set that's going to guarantee you continued promotion, raises, bonuses, etc. The reality, and I don't think this is too surprising, is we need to adapt. We need to look at the role, look at what we can do, and say, all right, how can I do it differently? We need to stay agile, frankly. That's really what it boils down to. The other side of it is realizing this is just a new challenge. This is just something new for me to embrace, something new for me to grow in my career, and understand that it is different. And that there's a lot of stuff about becoming an architect that's very different than what you might expect, but it's still a very, very rewarding position, especially when done right. So the first thing I want to talk about is some of the major differences that I experienced as I progressed my way up to the role of architect. I actually ran into a friend of mine in the hallway one day, and we were chatting about what we were working on, and I told her what I was doing, and she said, boy, I'm glad that's you and not me, because I have no interest in doing those things. And I said, well, that's good, because I really don't have interest in doing the things you're doing either, so this works out. Now, I know a lot of us get into this line of work because we enjoy programming, we enjoy coding. And it is a very enjoyable experience. It's a lot of fun to build, to create, to make the computer do what we want it to do. And part of what makes that so enjoyable is the fact that it's an incredibly objective thing. At the end of the day, you write a program, it either compiles or it doesn't. There's not a whole lot of in between. Your tests either pass or they don't. Our work as a developer on a typical project, it's a pretty steady state sort of an organism. You pull the next card, you get the next task, whatever it happens to be, barring, of course, the inevitable fire drill. One of the very first things you realize when you get into architecture is we don't have a red-green bar. There is no pass-fail at the architect level, at least not in the same category. We do, of course, have the ubiquitous stoplight analogy, the red, yellow, green. I have sort of this theory that at a certain level of management, the only thing you can think of is red, yellow, green. That's like the most detail you want to get into about a project is either it's going well or it's not going well or it's going terribly. And of course, they all want everything to be green, and what's our path to green and how are we going to get there? One of the big shifts I notice is that with coding, it's a fairly instantaneous gratification kind of thing, or maybe instant frustration depending on what you're working on in a given day. Architecture doesn't have that instantaneous aspect or attribute. One of the biggest challenges I faced when I first got into the architectural role was to realize that these tasks, these projects can last months, sometimes even years, and it can take a really, really long time to see the payoff from all that work. But it's an incredibly special feeling when it happens. Last year, I guided a project from, hey, this sounds like a good idea, to production, and it's the first time really in my career that I hadn't written any code for a project I was involved in. And I kind of thought, well, when they get to production, I'm certainly not going to feel great about that because I didn't do any of the work on the project. But I was surprised at how proud I was of the team and how proud I was of the work I had done on that project to get them through all the roadblocks and get them around all the issues that we had to deal with on this relatively simple project. Now, there is still coding in the architecture rank. There is far less of it than when you're a developer. That shouldn't come as too much of a surprise. And this is actually a bit of a shock to some people. I have worked with some folks who really thought it was kind of odd even that architects were still coding. Now, I don't really know where they got that notion from, because quite frankly, I think it's hard to do this job well if you don't have at least a little bit of exposure to the end coding work. But it certainly is nowhere near the same amount of coding you do as a developer. Again, shouldn't be too much of a surprise, but it is an adjustment for a lot of folks. So you have to ask yourself very honestly, am I okay with that? I've certainly worked with folks for whom coding is like air. They need to code in order to feel normal in a given day. If you need to code day in, day out, architecture is not going to give you that job satisfaction. You're not going to be able to scratch that itch, at least not during your 9 to 5. You're probably going to have to do that on your own time more. You're absolutely going to have more of a leadership mantle put upon you. You're going to be looked to for leadership. And that can be a little daunting at first. I had experience on a project last year. I knew basically nothing about the project. Somehow I'd been assigned as the architect on it, sort of, it was a mid-flight project. And there really wasn't a whole lot to do until one day they had a performance problem. And then all of a sudden, I was supposed to be the performance expert on a project I had basically no notion of how it ultimately worked at the end of the day. So I had to rely on my technical team to sort of tell me what we should do. And I will admit, it was a very daunting thing to be proposing a solution where I'm trusting fully in my team. I don't actually know if this is correct or not because it's in a language I don't have much experience with. It's in a technology I don't have much experience with. I got to put a lot of faith in them. That's a little bit of you feel like your neck's kind of stretched out there, and it's like, I hope you guys are right, because if you're wrong, I'm the one who looks like an idiot here, not you. A big part of it, too, is being a change agent. This is something we really stress in my organization, is getting folks out there to bring in new technology, bring in new tools, introduce new ideas into the organization. Now, at first breath, this is great, because you get to kind of be the agitator, get to move things around. The flip side of that, though, is you again immediately run into the politics of the fact that there's a lot of folks who don't want anything to change, and you are now bringing in new ideas. So that's an interesting contrast to deal with. You deal a lot with influence. I'll talk about that in a little bit. I really enjoy the fact that this position typically has a fair amount of autonomy. You don't have a whole lot of people sort of, looking over your shoulder, telling you what to do, telling you how to do it. And the downside of that is you are fully responsible for figuring out what it means to do your job, which can be very challenging some days. Our tasks tend to be far less task-based. We don't have a nice, clear-cut, code this page, then code that page, fix this bug, work on this defect. We rarely have a backlog as such. We're certainly not nearly as detailed as what some typical project backlogs look like. One of the biggest adjustments for me when I got into the role was realizing that it was my responsibility to go to the work. As a developer, you can be a little more passive, kind of sit back, sort of wait for the work to come to you. The project manager is maybe going to assign you something, or the tech lead is going to assign you something. You don't get that so much in architecture. I had a conversation with one of my peers a couple weeks back, and he basically dumped this very nebulous task into my lap. He said, I want you to go figure out what it means to do DevOps in the cloud and what the developer experience looks like as we move to the cloud. I said, okay, and what else? And he said, that's all I'm going to tell you, basically. Now, go make it happen. Okay, cool. So let me figure out what that means, figure out what you're looking for. And a lot of it is, frankly, well, let me try this, showing it to the person and saying, was this what you were thinking? No? Oh, okay, well, let me try again and see what else I can come up with. Our tasks tend to be very nebulous. Very almost not random, but they certainly don't have a lot of detail to them. Earlier this year, I was asked to go evaluate package managers for web, JavaScript sorts of things. And that was basically it. Go take these 3 or 4 people and figure out what we should be using for a package manager. Okay, how should we do that? You're the architect, figure it out. Okay, so we get the group together, we try to figure out what the criteria are, we try to figure out what the universe is, how many package managers are there in this space, which ones can we rule out just on principle, and then work through the process of getting this group of people to agree on something so that we can hand it over to some folks to, hey, go try these 3 things, looking at these 10 things, and report back to us. Now, here's one reality of being an architect. You're going to spend a lot more time in meetings than you did as a developer. As a developer, you can kind of skip a lot of that stuff. You can sort of let it be above you a little bit. As an architect, you're going to spend an awful lot of time in meetings. And there's going to be times that you're going to say, I don't really need to be here. I had a situation last year. I was included in a set of meetings. It was every single Monday for an hour. And I really didn't have a whole lot to add to the meeting. There wasn't a whole lot of questions for me. There wasn't a whole lot of stuff on my plate in that particular meeting. But they very much wanted me there. And I was talking to a friend of mine that's a project manager, and I said, why do you guys have us at that meeting if you don't really need us? And he said, well, I understand where you're coming from, and you're right that 9 days out of 10, I don't need you at that meeting. But boy, the 10th time, when we have a question and we need you to answer it, and you're right there and I can get the answer and move on, as opposed to having to track you down later, that's worth it. And that was one of the first times it occurred to me that a lot of this job, frankly, is giving other people the warm, fuzzy feeling. It isn't so much about me, it isn't so much about the direct technical contribution I'm making to the project, it's about making someone feel better about what's going on. So as much as I felt like, all right, I'm kind of wasting some of my time by being here, that was exactly what I needed to do to help that project and help that staff feel good about what was going on. So yes, you're going to spend more time in meetings. That's just the nature of the beast. Some of those meetings are going to be just painfully boring to sit through. It comes with the paycheck. Budget season is another unfortunate aspect of architectural work. We're in the midst of budget season right now in my organization, and it is a fairly unpleasant time of year for us because there's an awful lot of evaluating and reevaluating and reevaluating, and there's just lots of churn, and a lot of it, is going to get sort of thrown away anyway because there's a fixed pile of money, and a lot of it's already been allocated, but we need to sort of argue around the scraps of it anyway. So a lot of that is frustrating, but an important part of the job nonetheless. The other really challenging part of the role is the fact that in many organizations, we are looked at in sort of a governance role, and we're expected to make sure we're doing the right things, which inevitably means from time to time, you're going to have to tell people no. I'm not naturally good at this because it's hard to tell someone no and do it in a way that they feel okay about it. You can't just be, no, that was a stupid idea, leave me alone. That's not a great way to build rapport with your team. You need to be able to say no in such a way that they understand why. I had that experience last year on a couple projects I was involved with. My developers came up with some really cool solutions. Unfortunately, they were not solutions I could readily allow them to deploy. And so I had to have these conversations and say, guys, I really appreciate what you came up with here. That's really innovative. Unfortunately, if you want to use that, we're going to have to go get some sign-off from some folks. It's probably going to take a month or two. Are you okay with that? And they're like, oh, no, I bet we can find another way. So I said no without coming off like a total jerk, and that can be challenging. Now, a big part of that is helping them understand the bigger picture, help them understand the strategic vision for the company, help them understand why this project is moving in this direction and this project is moving in a different direction, what that means, how we should react to that. There's a lot of our job that's trying to figure out where do we think technology is going to be in a couple of years? How do we position the organization and these projects such that they can take advantage of that? One of our CIO, one of his big lines is, don't paint me into a corner. Make sure that we're making decisions that will hopefully be adaptable in 2 years, 5 years, et cetera. The other part of it that is both challenging and frankly kind of enjoyable is that you can move this role in a lot of different ways. You can do an awful lot with it. You can make up what you want to a certain extent, and you can go in a bunch of different directions. Now, in order to do that successfully, you need to be pretty self-motivated. That's one of the big challenges for a lot of folks. If you've had someone sort of right behind you saying, this is the next task I have for you, this is the next task I have for you, that's going to be a hard transition to now say, no, I have to plan my day. I have to figure out how am I going to get this done, or what priority am I going to have to knock down to a 2 or a 3. We typically don't have project managers hovering over us. Well, unless they're waiting for something, and then you'll hear no end from the project manager or the agile coach or whatever your organization calls them. So you have to take a step back and say, okay, am I working on the right stuff? Is this the right thing for me to be doing at this moment in time? And you better know the answer to that. One of the things that we talk about internally, if you're working on 6 or 7 things, but your customers only know about 2 or 3 of them, you don't get credit for 6 or 7 things. You get credit for 2 or 3. So you need to make sure they know what you're doing for them. It can be really hard to manage your time as an architect. A lot of us are spread relatively thin. We might have 8, 10, 15 projects, depending on the organization, depending how it's structured, and you need to be able to juggle that schedule. It's almost inevitable you're going to find yourself in a situation where you've got 2 or 3 meetings at the same time. You've got to figure out sort of who do I push off, who do I reprioritize for. That can be hard to do. It's not easy to decline a meeting when it's like, oh, that person needs my help. It's not easy to say, I can't talk to you right now. Can you schedule time for next week? But it's an important part of the job. My Friday, I thought was going to look one way, and it blew up completely because I kept getting these little one-off requests, these little, hey, can you help me with this? I need help with that. Do you have a minute to talk about that? And it's like, next thing I knew, it was the end of the day, and I'm like, what happened? I can't tell you how many times I think back on my week, and it's like, okay, what did I work on? I know I was busy, and then you kind of think back through it, and it's like, geez, I did a whole lot of stuff that wasn't what I planned on doing at the start of the week. That seems to be a very common attribute in architecture. Speaking of the one-offs, this is another very, very likely occurrence, especially if you're new to the role. When I first transitioned in, my boss gave me a lot of these sort of one-off, hey, can you go help so-and-so? I remember one of the first things I got assigned was, this particular person is looking for some video editing software, can you help them? I don't know anything about video editing software. This is not my expertise. But they needed help, and so I ran down the options, figured out what they needed, worked through a solution for them. And you know, your first breath on something like that is, gee, that seems like something that's, you know, beneath me as an architect. And then you realize, okay, well, that person might be really good friends with the vice president of whatever, and now you've done them a favor, and they say good things about you, and that reflects very positively on you, it reflects very positively on your architecture team. This is a win-win for everybody. You will inevitably hear the word, I have a growth opportunity for you. And this, quite frankly, is code. This is something your boss has figured out, wait, I don't want to do this, and I don't have to do it because I can make you do it. And you go, oh, great. This is how I first got introduced to budgeting season. My boss figured out, hey, wait, I don't have to tier these projects. I can make you do it. And all of a sudden, I became the architect for a bunch of projects I'd never heard of before that moment in time. So there you go. Now, honestly, it can be an awful lot like broccoli, or insert your least favorite vegetable here. It may not taste great, but it's still good for you. There's still a lot of positives that come out of that. The more you get in front of different people, the better off it is for your career. That's one of the biggest switches from being a developer to being an architect. As a developer, basically all you need to do is impress your immediate peers. As an architect, you're exposed to a much wider universe of folks. And it's really, really important that your customers know what it is you're doing for them. And this can be a hard transition. A lot of us don't naturally talk up our accomplishments or brag about what we're working on, if you want to think about it that way. But as an architect, it's really important that we reinforce to the folks we're working for that I did this for you. This is now complete. And it took me a little while to adapt to the fact that I need to send out these little one-sentence emails on a semi-regular basis. Security review is complete. Just to kind of keep reinforcing to folks that, yes, we are doing activity on your behalf. We have this accomplishment now that you can, and they'll reply back, you know, thanks, whatever. But it's just getting it on their radar screen that, yes, I am working on things for you. We're, you know, maneuvering through the bureaucracy, whatever it happens to be. Now, very closely linked to that is, are they happy? That's a tougher one to answer sometimes. But boy, you better know the answer to that, or you're going to be really, really surprised when review season comes around. Because this is how we get rated now, quite frankly. Are your customers happy with what you did for them this year, or not? Let's hope the answer is yes, they're delighted. The best thing that can happen is they say to your boss or one of your peers, our project would not have been where it is today but for insert your name here. The end of the day, it is assumed that you have technical skill. You don't get into the role of architect by not being able to code. Yeah, that's sort of table stakes. Raises and bonuses have essentially no relationship to your technical skill anymore. I had this conversation with my then manager when I first got into the role, and he was very blunt about this. He said, you know, Nate, I don't want you solving technical problems anymore. And that's a really hard thing to do, because most of us worked our way up through development ranks, became, you know, the proverbial tech lead, and we really enjoy getting that gnarly technical problem and taking it and chewing on it and solving it. And then they make you an architect, and it's like, no, that's not your job anymore. The tech lead is responsible for that. The way my manager talked to me about this, he said, you know what, if I've got a technical problem, I'm going to hire an engineer for that. And the analogy he used was a leaky pipe in your basement. He said, if I've got a leaky pipe in the basement, I'm not going to bring you in to fix it. At that point, I'm going to go call a plumber. And I'm going to say, hey, plumber, I have a leaky pipe. Go fix it, please. Now, if I'm building a new addition on my house, yes, there will be a plumber involved at some point, likely. But this is where the architect steps in. Our job is not to solve the day in, day out technical issue. It's to figure out, are we foundationally in a good place or not? We need to move this load-bearing wall. How do we do that without the entire structure coming crashing down around us? And so that's the big analogy. If we're fixing a pipe, if we need a new outlet, something like that, that's where we have the engineers. If we're building on, if we're adding new rooms, if we're tearing down walls, now we want an architect involved to make sure we're doing this in a sound manner, that this will grow over time. And that's challenging, because in a lot of cases, we get to a point with a project, and now it's going in a direction that we didn't anticipate when we first built it 2, 5, 10, 15 years ago. How do we move that forward in an intelligent way? One of the hardest transitions is to realize the technical skill set is not the end-all, be-all of how we're rated anymore. In my organization, the way we're looked at, your business knowledge is part of this. Obviously, technical is still there, but it's not nearly as important as it was as an engineer. Communication ability, man, do we harp on this point. And then leadership ability. So it is expected that you understand the business domain, perhaps more so than when you were a developer. You are also expected to interact with the domain experts far more typically than you did as a developer. Most of the time, you're expected to either have technical depth or breadth. Ideally, you have both. Ideally, you have a fairly broad skill set, and then you've gone deep in at least one or two areas. But communication level, this to me is one of the most important skills an architect can have. If you cannot communicate effectively, you basically cannot be an effective architect. The longer I do this, the more I believe this is really the core of our job. It all boils down to educating, it all boils down to our ability to communicate with folks. And part of what makes it so difficult is we're not just communicating to one audience. We have multiple audiences, and we need to adjust our message accordingly. So we need to understand what level are we speaking to. The kind of conversation you'll have with a group of developers is very different than if you need to discuss that same topic with a group of sort of senior leadership type folks. And we need to be able to adapt and work our way through different communities. The same sort of acronym-heavy presentation you might give to your development community is just going to cause VP-type folks to roll their eyes back and glaze over, and they'll totally tune you out. Leadership is interesting as well. It's expected that you're supposed to be able to lead yourself. You're able to figure out, what do I need to be working on? What do I need to be doing? How do I solve these problems? Make sure my customers are happy. They know what I'm working on their behalf. But you also need to lead teams and perhaps even influence an entire organization. This is one of the big things we're working on right now, is trying to figure out, what does cloud mean for our organization? What does it mean for our applications? How do we ready our applications for this as we start pushing more aggressively into that space? And it isn't just as simple as going out and bringing in Pivotal or something like that. There's a lot more to it. And almost all the discussions we have are not so much on the technical side. The technical problems are easy to solve ultimately. It's all the cultural issues that come along with it. How do you move a culture? How do you get a group of developers to start doing things in a different way? How do you deal with the fact that inevitably, when you bring in this new change, some groups are going to disappear? And those folks are going to resist that. So how do we work that out? Now, one of the other things that's fascinating about architecture, there's a bunch of different roles within an architectural organization. And depending on what role you happen to be fulfilling at a given moment, your proficiencies vary in these fields. So our VP of architecture, he used to be technical. He's not anymore. He certainly isn't as technical as our solution architects. But you know what? He's really, really good at communicating, and he's really, really good at sort of the nebulous leadership type things that he has to deal with at his level. And I am very thankful he's there, because I want nothing to do with his job. I don't want to be dealing with all the politics of it and the backroom, budgeting sessions and all that kind of stuff. One of the big challenges, though, is figuring, okay, what am I good at in these various capabilities? What do I need to work on? What do I need to improve on? Do I need to take some courses on how to be a bit better presenter or a better writer? Do I need to work on my leadership type skills? And one of the big things you start figuring out is there's some educational opportunities that earlier in your career you probably would have rolled your eyes at or sort of dismissed as, well, that's nothing I need to worry about. All of a sudden, those become really important. And as much as you may have a little bit of cynicism when you look at them or look at their description, they're worth your time in many, many cases. Now, I cannot emphasize enough how important the role of communication is in this job. And it takes such a wide variety of implementations here. You're going to have communication in meetings. You're going to write a lot of email. You're going to create a lot of documents. You're also going to work a lot directly with people. So just in case you weren't sure, these are people. They're a lot like us. They're generally not quite as technical, but they're very similar in many ways. The reality is you're going to have to deal with them more than you did as a developer. That's part of the deal. So if you really don't like that, maybe reconsider your job opportunities here. Now, the other side of this that can be hard to get your head wrapped around sometimes is you're going to have to do some things you don't like. There are absolutely some things as an architect that I'm like, I just don't want to deal with this. This is not something I enjoy doing. And every time I bring that up, my boss says, comes with the paycheck. If you don't want to do those things, that's fine, Nate. We can arrange that. It's also going to mean you have a different job. So it's just understanding there are things that are good about it. There's things that are less good, but that's true of any job. I don't think that really is too much of a surprise to anybody. But it is a far more subjective experience. And that can be really hard for us as we transition out of a job that is much, much more objective to one that isn't. It's a little bit like flipping a switch there. There's a lot of things that don't compile. You pull together an architectural document of some sort. Is it a good one? I don't know. There's no red-green here. There's a continuum. There's some absolute perfect architecture document out there, at least the ideal of one. And then there's, I can't believe you even put this into a document. This is terrible. What were you thinking? A group of screaming monkeys could have done something better. Everything else is somewhere in between. We can write better documents, and it's also going to be depend an awful lot on who's looking at it. So you got to ask yourself, are you okay with that? Are you okay with a career that is less objective than being a programmer? Because if you're not, this would be a good opportunity to rethink that particular career aspiration. It is definitely a bit of a transition. Again, I cannot emphasize enough how important communication ability is to being a successful architect. It's absolutely vital to the role. You need to be a good presenter. That's a hard transition for a lot of folks, is realizing you're going to have to get up in front of groups. Sometimes this is small groups, sometimes this is big groups. In my organization and our architecture community, it is just table stakes that every year you will give a presentation to the larger community. That's non-negotiable. Everybody is going to give a presentation. Sometimes that's a very straightforward thing to a group of developers. There are other times where it's like, you need to go to this SLT member's staff meeting and present on Project X. You're going to write architecture documents, build architectural models, things of that nature. You're also going to spend a fair amount of time on email. I know that's unfortunate, but it is kind of part of the deal. Here's what it boils down to. This concept of an architecture, quite frankly, doesn't exist. It is a fiction. It is a story that we make up. The challenge is telling that story, telling it coherently, and telling it not just to developers. That's very important. If they don't understand it, guess what? They can't actually build the thing. So that's sort of, step one, making sure they get it. But you also have to make sure that customers understand it, that management understands it, people paying the bills understand it. Because they're going to have questions, they're going to have input on a lot of these things too. So it's important that your team understands it, otherwise they can't build it. So can they explain it to you? Do they understand what you're doing and hopefully why you're doing it? So ask them to tell the story to you on as many opportunities as you can find. Take advantage of the stand-ups, take advantage of retros, take advantage of any ad hoc opportunity to say, hey, do you understand why we're building it in this particular way? My organization, we do an awful lot of things these days that are, RESTful web service backends. I won't quite say microservices yet, but, buzzword of the day, with client-rendered UI. And I have spent most of the last couple of years telling that story to a wide variety of people, getting them to understand it. And a lot of them get it. We still have a few holdouts. But it isn't just this small matter of implementation detail. Although these get really interesting. I had a really odd meeting Earlier this year, I got dragged into a room. It was a very hostile room. It was one of the few times in my career I've truly been in a situation where there were a couple people who really did not like me in that room at that moment. And what I ended up figuring out after about 20 minutes is someone in their organization had heard me say JavaScript MVC, JavaScript MV star. And they had somehow taken that to mean they needed to build their entire application using Windows MVC. It's like, no, that's an implementation detail-y kind of thing. And so these guys were very upset because they thought they were going to have to rewrite their entire application, which was almost done, because of what Nate said. I was the embodiment of their hate in that moment in time because they were literally looking at 5 years of work potentially having to be completely rewritten because of me. It was kind of uncomfortable. Once I figured out what was going on, it's like, oh, okay, let me talk you down off that ledge, get everybody happy. We almost hugged at the end, so I felt like I did something right. But this is part of the challenge, is being able to explain what you're doing, not just to developers. That's frankly the easy thing, because we all usually come from that community. It's also being able to explain it to folks above them in the org chart, above you in the org chart. How do you explain it to someone who's writing the check? Because we go in and try to throw out a bunch of acronyms and say this buzzword or that buzzword. They don't care about that. This is where, quite frankly, we need to take a page from the sales engineering playbook. So if you have an opportunity to watch how these enterprise products get sold, watch how they get marketed, you can learn an awful lot. You don't need to sell your soul necessarily, but there are tips you can pick up from these folks. Understand what they do and how they do it, because it is inevitable that some of these vendors speak really good exec, and you should be taking notes on that, borrowing where you can. How you communicate matters so much more than you can possibly imagine. You need to get rid of any sort of, oh my God, can't you just read the manual? How stupid are you? Can't you just Google that? That just doesn't go very far. You need to patiently explain, and sometimes 3 or 4 times, before they understand. Pretend it's your in-laws and you're explaining how they need to set up something on their computer. This happens to me on a fairly regular basis. I love my in-laws. They're wonderful people. They do not understand technology. Presentations matter so much. It is really, really important that you get comfortable with the idea of presenting. There are a lot of great books on the topic. I'm rather partial to the one I help write, but there's a lot of good material out there. If you don't like my book, that's fine. There's a lot of other good ones out there. You need to get good at it. You need to practice it. Find as many opportunities as you can to give presentations. Do lunch and learns or brown bag sessions. Speak at your local user groups. Speak to your pet cat or your pet dog. Give yourself as many opportunities to get up in front of a crowd as possible. You also need to understand how your organization works. What kinds of style works best? How do you need to present? And that may mean you need to adjust your message for them, even if you're like, ugh, I really don't like that particular PowerPoint presentation style, but if that's what I got to do to get my message across, then that's what I got to do. You need to become very good at figuring out where the pain points are in the organization and how you can solve those. And a huge part of that is looking at what the executives lay out as, hey, here's my goals for the year, here's where we're trying to take IT, and do everything you can to align your stuff towards that. Even if it's a bit of a stretch, if you can somehow hide it under that category, good things happen. We had a CIO come in and say, you know what, release weekends, they suck, we need to do that better. And of course, he was thinking more in terms of how do we automate that or how do we make releases smoother. And of course, we looked at that as, hey, this is a perfect opportunity to force some more code quality initiatives. And so we use that as an opportunity to push a whole bunch of code quality things, hanging it under the banner of release weekends will be better. You need to listen more. This is hard. This is not something that comes naturally, at least not to me. And you need to ask yourself, what are they concerned about? What is it that bothers them? What is it that wakes them up in the middle of the night? Because there's probably some legitimate things there. You may not necessarily agree that that's the most important thing in the organization, but you need to listen to that stuff. And if you just sort of passively dismiss it, that doesn't end well for us. You need to address it. You need to have a conversation. This can be hard. Again, this doesn't come naturally to some of us. Now, as much as you may want to say, hey, let's make a fight out of it, let's go a few rounds, because as developers, we do this a lot, don't we? We get into some very passionate conversations about technology. People from the outside would say we fight a lot. I don't think we really do, because I don't think any of us really mean it in a negative way. But we need to look at ourselves objectively and say, how am I communicating? How is that coming across to the audience? Am I being respectful? Or am I being the typical derisive, cynical developer type person? And then once again, very humbly asking ourselves, what works better? When I'm respectful or when I try to poke holes at the VP? Because let's be honest, if you're fighting up the org chart, understand that at certain points they will tell you to, sit down and be quiet just because they can. Just out of respect to the office, as it were. You will inevitably find yourself in a game of enterprise operator at some point in your career. This is just the nature of having a team of more than 3 or 4 people. The way this has manifested for me has been multiple different times, and usually boils down to some implementation of this. I heard that you aren't using the enterprise standard. I heard you're out of compliance with. Now, the first time this happened to me, I thought, oh, geez, I did something wrong. I was working on a project. We were doing this typical client-rendered UI with REST web service backend. The web services just happened to be written in .NET. The client rendering happened to be in Angular. And man, I got so much back and forth from people saying, I heard that you're out of compliance with it. And it's like, okay, well, there is no enterprise standard here. And we're actually basically the exact same as that project is anyway. We just have a couple minor little deviations. And I just went around and around and around on that. Probably my favorite instance of this, one of our project managers was giving a presentation where he mentioned that the application sent out email. Now, that's not actually what he said, but that's how it got interpreted by the audience. What the application actually did was text you. And it just so happened that in some cases, we could text you with an email address. And so now all of a sudden, people were all up in arms. Did you hear this? Did you hear that? And I got security guys are calling me saying, your app can't do this. And it took me a little while to figure out what was going on until I realized, oh, he misspoke in a presentation full of a whole bunch of people who had a very small amount of the story, and now I have to diffuse that situation. And so once I got to the bottom of it, it was fine, but that was not the way I planned on spending a couple of days of my life. Now, I thought, frankly, again, the first time this happened to me, I had done something wrong. I had failed somewhere along the way. And I was talking to my boss about it, and he said, no, you can't stop it. It's going to happen. This is an inevitable part of the job, especially in big organizations. His point to me was not, don't sweat the fact that it happened, but make sure you're prepared. Make sure that you can tell the story. Because that's all people are really looking for here. Somebody takes a little nugget out of some meeting or some passing hallway conversation, and all of a sudden they're like, wait, I don't think this is right. And they're going to try to show that they're the boss or whatever. They're going to let their will be felt. And you need to have the story ready so they can say, oh, okay, well, I just want to make sure that you are on top of that. It's like, yep, we got it. We knew that was happening. We're already taking care of it. We usually talk about this internally as the 1, the 5, and the 30. So it's expected in our role that you're going to have a 1-minute presentation ready, a 5-minute presentation ready, and a 30-minute presentation ready. And so basically what that boils down to is the 1 minute is what would you say if you ran into the VP in the hallway or in the elevator? You're not going to have 2 hours with these folks. You're going to have a passing influence opportunity. Do you have something coherent to say? We used to go around at our staff meeting, and our boss would occasionally say, all right, guys, give me your 1 minute, go. And he'd let people talk. And then he would stop them and say, you've been talking for 2.5 minutes. The VP got off the elevator 3 minutes ago, basically. And it was like, but that's not enough time. You're right. You need to cut to the chase. What's important? Get your message out there quickly. The 5 minutes is what happens if somebody says, I want you to come to this next team meeting and talk to us about this initiative you're working on. And there's a difference between being invited to a staff meeting of a bunch of other developer type folks versus a vice president would like you to come speak to his or her direct reports. Now what do you do? Yeah, it's going to be a different message. I actually had that happen to me last week. Someone said, hey, can you come to so-and-so staff meeting? We'd like you to present on this thing you're working on. It's like, oh, okay, well, that's a new one on me. I'll have to figure that out on the fly. And then the 30 is what happens if somebody says, we'd like you to give an overview of your project to the wider community. The moral of the story is you need to be ready for those opportunities because they're going to come, and you want to look good when it happens. And the only way that happens is you need to practice. You need to have a 1 minute in your back pocket. You need to have a 5 minute in your back pocket so that when those opportunities arise, you're not stuck going, good to see you. Yeah, no, I'm working on really important stuff. Let me tell you about that. Let me think about what it is. Now, the other part of this can get really frustrating, is you're going to repeat yourself. You're going to say the same thing again and again and again, or as we often refer to it as, you got to say it 3 times before they understand it. And sometimes that's more like 33 times, depending on your audience. One of the ways that I've had success working with this is what we call either a conceptual architecture document or an architectural concept document. It's just a real simple 1, 2, 3 page kind of document. It's not everything under the sun. It's a very high level kind of a thing. Key concerns, key gaps, capabilities, maybe a couple of diagrams or two, nothing real in depth, but just enough that when someone says, hey, so what are we doing in mobile right now? What are we doing with cloud right now? You've got something ready. So they're like, oh, okay, well, good. I'm glad you guys are on top of it. I'm glad you're paying attention to it. And there's no formal sort of model to that for us. It all boils down to this very simple fact. We need to use whatever we can to tell the story. That's our job in a nutshell, is telling the story and telling it effectively. And if that means you need to have a whole bunch of really complicated UML-like models, then that's what you need. If it's more of a touchy-feely, fuzzy kind of thing, then that's what you need. If it's sitting down with someone one-on-one every Friday for 2 months, then that's what it is. That's the job. It's telling the story, telling it effectively, telling it again and again and again. Another huge part of this job is influencing people. So one of the biggest challenges you run into as an architect is you need to get people to do things, and you don't actually have, you can't force them to do it. They don't report to you. So I led a team last year, not one of them reported to me. I wasn't involved in their review, I didn't have any control over their raise or their bonus, and yet I'm supposed to tell them what to do. Now, there's two basic approaches to making someone do something for you. There's the hammer approach. You will do this because I said so and I have a bigger hammer than you do. Or there's the ninja approach. You sneak around the back. Now, the best way I can describe these is telling you a story about my son. My boy is 8 now. When he was younger, the daycare center that we used to take him to, they had this standing rule. When you get there in the morning, before you release the child into general population, they're supposed to wash their hands. Now, if any of you have young kids, you know how this conversation goes. Everett, please wash your hands. What is my son's response? No. Now, it's early in the morning. I have not had my customary espresso yet, and so I put on my dad hat. Everett, go wash your hands. I'm your father. To which, of course, he just responds, no, never. Now, this is where my wife steps in. She is so much better at this stuff than I am, and she just looks at our boy and goes, hey, buddy, I bet I can get my hands washed before you can. And she takes one step towards the sink, and he runs over there, and he's washing his hands. He's laughing. Ha, Mommy, I'm going to beat you. She says, yes. Yes, you are. Now, I have to admit, as a parent, it's taken me a while to adjust to that, but I don't know what happens when this stops working. If any of you have older kids and have any advice on how to get them to do things when they no longer buy into that, when you can't challenge them that way, I'm all ears. I'm tempted to use a cattle prod as he gets older, but I don't know if that's a legitimate parenting technique or not. I ran into a really great quote that helped sum this up as well, and I just thought this was really brilliant. Reform often advances most rapidly by indirection. Because when you take the direct approach, the people who know things are going to get disrupted, their first reaction is to push back and say, no, you're not changing anything on my watch. If you sneak around the side, they don't notice. And then all of a sudden the change is in place, and I'm like, okay, cool. Now, I can't force you to change. If you've ever been in a relationship with another human being, you know you can't force people to change, but I can influence you. One of the hardest parts about being an architect is realizing that I cannot directly influence everyone in the organization. In fact, there are very few people I can directly influence. I need to influence the influencers. Very indirect. I ran into this. I was at a company a long time ago now, longer than I care to admit, and I was trying to bring in unit testing. We had pretty massive code quality issues, and we were trying to fix that, and so I gave kind of that standard, TDD, JUnit pitch, and I thought, this is like a basic thing, right? Every developer is going to embrace this, and I practically got booed out of that room. I thought, well, geez, that's strange. And then I figured out that I hadn't been there long enough. I didn't have tenure in the organization, and so I wasn't respected yet. And so I kind of looked around and went, hey, Jason, you buy into these ideas. And so I worked with Jason, and I got Jason's team fired up. And Jason was in a position where he could say, hey, guys, you're writing tests or you're off my team. And so they all wrote tests, and all of a sudden, code quality was no longer an issue for that part of the code base. And other people started, hey, what's going on in Jason's area? And so then Jason got up and gave basically the exact same presentation I gave. And it was all like, standing ovation and tears and hugs. And I'm like, wait, I said the same thing. So I had to influence the influencer, but I got what I wanted. Now, the other side of this that's really hard is understanding that for folks, if I try to force you to change, that usually backfires on me. I need to help people understand what's in it for them. I have to help them see why this end is good. It's also important to understand that change is hard to maintain, that we inevitably get worse before we get better. And when we get worse, it's really easy to say, can we go back to the way we were doing it before? Because that was better. So Seth Godin calls this the dip. So if we have our current situation, we're somewhere over here, and I really want us to be up here. If I don't do a good job of explaining why up here is good, as soon as we get down in here, the whole team's like, whoa, this is a crappy idea. Nate, you're an idiot for even proposing it. This is why it's so hard to force people to change. If it's not your idea, working through the dip is really hard. Right? So it's pushing through the dip that's the challenge. That's why the hammer so rarely works in these cases. The other thing that's really hard to understand is it takes a long time for change to take hold. We need to be patient. Now, that's not something I excel at. We also need to understand that change overwhelms people. You change too much at once, people's heads explode. So be very, very cautious there. If you try to come in and change your entire technology stack and entirely change your process and throw everything out, you will fail. And a lot of what this boils down to is we forget what it was like to be a kid, to be a baby. The fact that it used to be a big deal just to roll over. And then it was a big deal to crawl. And then it was a big deal to walk. And we forget how long that takes. Think of any technology that you've come to adopt and love. For me, Git was one of those. I remember when I first saw the presentation on Git that was done at Google, where basically Linus is up there saying if you use Subversion or CVS, you're an idiot. I thought, well, wait, I use Subversion. I'm not an idiot. This is a kind of a strange way to pitch a product. If you're not using my product, you're an idiot. And it took me a while to adapt, and it took me a while to until all of a sudden you sort of flip over and you're like, wow, this is great. I love this. This enables a really cool way of working. And you forget about how long it takes you to get there. And then you meet somebody new and you're like, oh man, you guys don't use Git. Oh, you're so stupid. It's like, wait, no, they just haven't made the journey yet. Your job is to help them make that journey. What does that look like? How are you going to Sherpa them through that? It's not easy. Man, I wish I could give you the magic recipe for do this, then this, then this, and out the other end comes insert your favorite technology. It's not how it works. Another interesting shift about becoming an architect is the fact that all of a sudden relationships become a much bigger deal than they were as a developer. Not that it's, you have to have good relationships as a developer, you want to have good relationships with your team, but you get into the architecture ranks and it's not about the technology anymore. A lot of what it boils down to is who can you work with? Who can you contact? It ends up being a lot about your network, about what other folks in this organization can you reach out to, who else can you influence? Who knows who you are? One of the hardest parts about this job is realizing that at the end of the day, my review is largely decided by a group of people that are 2 or 3 rungs above me in the organization. And if my boss is sitting in a meeting talking about all the great things I did, and someone in there says, I've never heard of this guy before, it's really hard for him to advocate on my behalf. That necessitates that we have to move beyond our little cocoon. We have to move beyond our immediate peers. So I have an architecture team, and I hope they all believe I do good work. I think most of them believe I do good work. And that's important, but it's far more important that folks outside of that area understand, oh yeah, Nate, he's a good guy. He did this for my project and that for my project. And I heard from 2 of my PMs that their projects would have been months later had he not been involved. That's what you need to have in your corner when it's review season. And this is where it gets hard because we now need to play retail politics, a game that you really didn't need to do when you're just sitting in the project room. You need to go out and you need to cultivate these relationships. One of the easiest ways to do that is go get a cup of coffee with people. Now, I love this because I don't think there's enough coffee in the world. I'm happy to drink another cup. Yes, please. More espresso. One of the greatest moments of my life was when my wife said, I think we need a home espresso machine. This was a huge win for me. Take people out for a cup of coffee. My previous manager used to keep a list of names next to his computer. And if he had like a half hour free up, if a meeting got canceled, he'd kind of scan down the list, look at the IM client and figure out if they were available and say, hey, you want to get a cup of coffee? He'd go and buy him a cup of coffee. He didn't have a specific agenda. He didn't have something specific he needed to tell them about. But he used it as an opportunity to reaffirm that relationship, let them know these are the things we're working on. Now you can take it a step further and take them out to lunch, buy them lunch. I had a manager early on in my career who said he got more free lunches by buying people lunch than he can possibly count. And it works on two levels, because I buy you lunch, and now maybe in a couple of weeks you say, hey, can I take you out to lunch? I owe you lunch. But then it also crops up when you're in a meeting with someone and they're like, I kind of owe Nate because he did take me out to lunch, so I'm going to help him with this, or I'm going to volunteer to help, or I'm going to help smooth this over. I can speak on his behalf because you know what? At lunch the other day, he and I actually talked about that project. And by the way, this doesn't have to be a strictly work-related thing. In fact, I think it's important that we talk with our coworkers about more than just work, that we talk about our families and our hobbies and our interests, because, man, this world gets a lot more interesting when we're not just these little two-dimensional autonoma that plug into some project org chart somewhere. Make your coworkers feel valued. I hate that I even have to mention something like this because this feels like kindergarten, but I'm amazed at how many times this crops up where teams don't do that and they act rudely towards one another. I just read an article earlier today. There's a fair amount of research that indicates you shorten your life when you're rude to people, that this has a very negative effect on people's health. Show interest in them. Hey, what'd you do this weekend? Oh, how was that concert? Hey, how's your kid doing? Be empathetic. Now, this is hard because some of us don't naturally come by that, but that's part of the job, is being able to put yourself in other people's shoes. And a lot of this, quite frankly, boils down to the golden rule. Treat them how you would like to be treated. Be respectful. This should be obvious, but I've seen organizations where that respect didn't happen, and it's generally very, very negative to team morale. I've seen situations where one bad manager destroyed a team, absolutely decimated a team. It's amazing how much of an impact just one person can have. Say thank you. It's one of the most powerful things you can do. Thank you. Thank you for your work on that project. Thank you for your help on that architectural document. My previous manager was awesome at this. I'd run through a wall for that guy because he went out of his way to say thank you. Be genuine. That shouldn't be hard. It is for some people. Compliment people. Hey, good work on that presentation. Good work on that project review. Good work on that architecture diagram. Be positive. Again, shouldn't be hard to do. Most people don't like hanging around with the negative person in the room. Ask for and offer help. Be the first person to volunteer. I can help you with that. Do you need help with that? How can I help you with that? One of the best compliments I've ever gotten, my manager came to me one day and he said, when you actually offer to help, people think you mean it. And at first I was kind of like, wait, you mean people offer and they don't mean it? Maybe I'm just, because I'm a Midwestern guy, I just kind of thought that was a natural, but apparently that's a lot of people say, I'll help you with that, and then walk away. Be an active listener. Again, not one of my strengths. I'm not a great listener. I'm working on it. But you need to understand their work style too. As you work with other people, different folks have different ways of working. You need to sort of adapt to them and plug in that way as opposed to trying to make them change to you. Be one of the first people to volunteer. Hey, we need somebody to help with the all-hands meeting. I can help you with that. Hey, somebody needs help formatting this. I can help you with that. It just helps reinforce that you're a helpful person, you're a good part of the team, you're doing good work. It really isn't that hard to develop these kinds of relationships. But it takes time, it takes cultivation, and it works its way up from the grassroots. Because at the end of the day, what we absolutely have to do is make sure that our work is visible, that people know what we do. In a lot of organizations, architects have kind of a bad rep. There's sort of that term like drive-by architecting. The person that shows up, draws a bunch of boxes on the whiteboard, and then walks out, and everyone's like, who is that? We don't want that. That's bad. That gives all of us a bad name. You want to be in a situation where the members of the teams you're working with genuinely appreciate your help and say nice things when you're not in the room. Those one-off tasks, as much as, again, you may want to blow those off, it's amazing how much of an impact that can have. Just helping one person on one simple thing, you never know. Maybe that person, plays tennis with somebody and they say something about you in a positive light, and that comes back to you, 3 months later when review season hits, and it's like, oh, you got this kudos from the senior vice president. It's like, wow, I didn't even know that there was a connection there. A lot of that, again, gets back to that influencing the influencers. It's not a direct path. Now, the next thing is what happens after you become an architect. And this was something I've thought a lot about actually last summer. My wife and I both kind of hit that point where, I'd become an architect, she'd become, I guess, a senior business analyst. And I remember we were driving home one day from work and we were just kind of asking each other, so what's next? What do we do after this? Now, luckily, architect is a lot like developer, designer. It's an incredibly broad term, and it means a lot of different things in different organizations. It can mean different things even within an organization and in different parts of it. So you have to look at it as something that has a lot of different roles that you can plug into. Now, you may use slightly different language in your organization, but this is generally what I've seen it boil down to. Solution architect is where a lot of us start our architectural career. This is where we usually live with the project. We've got direct project responsibility. You're going to be day in, day out, probably in a project room or an agile setting, something like that. This is by far the most heavy coding aspect of being an architect. This is where you're basically embedded with the team. Now, in some organizations, this is really just a senior developer. It might even be more of a role as opposed to a specific title. There might not actually be a title called solution architect. This is where a lot of us start. And I like it quite a bit as a good starting location because it gives you a lot of that interaction. It's a more gentle migration into the architect role as opposed to going immediately from developer to, okay, you're an architect person. Next step up from that is sometimes referred to as a portfolio architect. And so at this point, you no longer have one specific project you're responsible for. You typically have a set of applications or perhaps one really, really big project, depending. You're going to spend a lot of your time working with those solution architect type folks. So you're going to get dragged into some of the day-to-day, but a lot of it is more kind of the initial kind of kickoff of a project at various stages along the way, or anytime something bad happens, like for me last year when, hey, we have a performance problem, and all of a sudden I became the performance expert on that project. This role tends to be much more aligned with kind of the business leadership, the senior leadership on the project, so you tend to have a lot more visibility in that regard, which can be very good for your career. It tends to be a little more higher level, a little more vision, roadmap-y kind of a thing. That can be good or bad. Definitely the high visibility thing, if you're doing good work, works out well at review time. If you're doing bad work, doesn't work out so well. This is typically where architects will pick up direct reports. I'm always a little fuzzy on that. I like the idea of maybe there being a little more of a separation there, but this is one of those things that is pretty inevitable at some point. You end up having other people report to you, and then you get responsible for all the day-to-day HR stuff, which can be a real pain. There's also this concept of a domain architect. And so this is more technical than an individual project architect typically, but you're a lot more focused. So it's a specific domain. You're responsible for understanding that technology capability, enabling it within the organization, doing what we refer to as like foundational tasks. So if you got to bring in new product, working with procurement, getting licenses, getting it distributed, et cetera. My organization, we've got areas like mobile, that's where I live, there's Java, there's security, there's integration, et cetera. We spend a lot of our time dealing with sort of reference implementations or the first time a project's ever going to use a certain technology, pulling things out of those projects so other teams can learn from that, putting together standards, best practices, et cetera. We do a lot of like project evaluation kinds of things. So if somebody says, hey, we need a new library to do this, guess what? That's our responsibility to go figure that out. We work with a lot of the portfolio architects and the solution architects to kind of figure out, hey, what gaps do you have coming up on the horizon? What do we need to do to fill that? A lot of this is sort of team enablement and anything we can do to make them successful. My first exposure to this, my manager was very blunt. He said, you know what, making the decision on the library is easy. That's not what I'm paying you to do. I'm paying you to make sure teams can be successful with that product. So you go ahead and choose this library, that's great. But if 6 months from now, a year from now, teams aren't successfully implementing with that, it will show up on your review. It's like, okay, got it. There's also this notion of discipline architect, which is similar to domain, but it tends to be much more focused even than that, and it tends to be very narrow on a specific technology, a specific business. So in my organization, we've got information architects, security architects, and there's various folks in the business domains as well. They have an interesting job in the sense that they get to consult across a whole bunch of different projects. So they're about as close to a consultant as we get internally, at least. We also have this notion of enterprise architect, and this tends to have a negative connotation in a lot of organizations. Their job is to kind of sit above the fray, work across the organization. These tend to be the most senior architects in a company. They're trying to kind of come up with patterns, roadmaps, et cetera, making sure we're not reinventing the wheel again and again and again and again. Ideally, they're sitting there pulling things up and then kind of pushing out enterprise level solutions. They tend to live with senior leaderships, the C-suite, all that kind of fun stuff. They have very little day-to-day project interaction. They tend to be a little more astronaut-y than I'd like, but that does tend to happen. There's typically going to be at least one VP of architecture, something like that. These are not technical folks. They're much more organizationally focused, making sure we've got budget, massaging egos, doing staff dev, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the first things that I discovered is these are not static roles, that at least in my organization, we typically span these. Last year I had sort of portfolio responsibility, I had domain responsibility. This year I'm more domain focused. It just sort of varies as project work comes and goes, and a lot of that depends on the organization, and you of course can move from slot to slot. Now, the hard challenge is realizing you're not going to grow as much technically as you did as a developer. You're not always going to be picking up that next new thing. Now, you're going to be doing some, obviously, but this role tends to be much more focused on leading project, leading people, and influencing, and then growing into bigger projects, bigger teams, etc. Now, the moral of the story, it's a different job than a lot of us maybe anticipated when we were just a developer. But I got to tell you, I love it. I love being in the position. I'm enjoying the heck out of it most days. I would much rather be in that lead sled dog role than the person in the back whose view never changes. So, end of the day, guys, have fun. Thank you so much for spending some time with me today. I really appreciate it. I hope you're enjoying the conference, and I hope you have a great evening. Thank you so much.